Hi everyone, my name is Seungone, and today I'm going to talk about this project evaluating language models as synthetic data generators, which is a preprint under review currently. So as a starting motivation, I'd like to talk about that we're running out of data to train language models. So this plot is from this paper, Will We Run Out of Data? Limits of LLM Scaling Based on Human-Generated Data. So as we all know, scaling a model size was considered the most important factor a while ago, back in 2020. Since then, a lot of papers, especially including neural scaling law paper, identified that it's not only important to scale the size of your model, but it's also very important to scale the data amount you use to train these large models. So here on this figure, you can see that this paper predicted that by 2028, we'll run out of data. And that could be a big bottleneck for us to train even better models than we have today. So one direction that has emerged to mitigate this issue was synthetic data. So synthetic data refers to data that's generated by neural models. There's kind of contrasting viewpoints regarding the promise of synthetic data. So for example, on this paper, which is called AI Models Collapse When Trained on Recursively Generated Data, they argue that synthetic data cannot be as useful as real data, which refers to human written data. But on the other hand, this computer vision paper called Improving the Scaling Laws of Synthetic Data with Deliberate Practice has a slightly different viewpoint. So they argue that given the same amount of data, if you perform this deliberate practice or very careful consideration to harness your synthetic data, you can get much out of the same model. So on the plot on the right, you could see that using the same 1.3 million synthetic data, you could reach much higher performance if you harness your data very carefully. So how does this relate to large language models? There has been a lot of paper that proposed how to generate data, synthetic data very well. But roughly speaking, I think these methods could be categorized into three categories. So the first is instance generation, and I'll go by one of how different methods were proposed for these categories. So let's first talk about instance generation. So in this scheme, we have a small amount of human-crafted instruction data that consists of instruction and response pairs. We would randomly sample a few instances and use them as in-context demonstrations. And based on this, we would generate a new instance that also consists of an instruction and response pair. And then optionally, we could do some filtering process or decide whether or not to store this instance to our buffer, and then do this process iteratively until we reach a number of instances that we desire. So these two papers are the most pioneering papers in synthetic data for LLMs. So on the left figure, you could see that the authors from this paper, Unnatural Instructions, found a very interesting phenomenon that if you provide three examples that consist of an instruction input and you pass it into a model, the model would generate this pinkish letters, which is a new instance. And then using this instance, you can train a smaller model or even the model itself. And the model would improve performance-wise. The right paper called Self-Instruct, which is very well known, came out in a very similar timing with unnatural instructions. And basically, they did a very similar. So you could see that they start with 175 seed tasks, which are input-output pairs written by human experts. And then starting from these 175 tasks, you would ask the model to refer to a few examples. So you would sample 8 demonstrations from these 175 tasks, and then ask the model to come up with a new one. And then they proposed this pipeline where a language model would be prompted again to determine if this is a classification task or a generation test. And then you would use these different prompts to generate the remaining components. And then you would do some filtering and then decide whether or not to put this newly generated instance back in the task pool. I think that a lot of people might be a bit more familiar with this alpaca model if you are not even if you are not heard about the previous two projects. So in alpaca, they use the same pipeline as self-instruct. I think they use the same 175 self-instruct C tasks as well. The difference here is that back at the time, the MetaLlama model was just released, which was a very proficient model for an open source model. And then for the first time, they demonstrated that in academia size, you could train a model that's performant as proprietary models back at the time. So Alpaca 7B used the self-instruct pipeline, synthetic data, to be trained. Next, I'd like to talk about response generation. So different to instance generation in this scheme, we assume that we have a lot of instructions, but do not have a very good response. And then only taking the instruction, you would ask a model to generate the response, and then you would use this data again to train the model itself or a smaller model. Here are two examples regarding response generation. So both of these papers also came out in a very similar timing. The main motivation back then was that we didn't have a lot of data that has COT data inside. So we wanted to train smaller models to generate chain of thoughts, but back at the time, we didn't have the data. So a lot of papers, including these two, utilized existing data sets from the community and then prompted either GPT-4 or very proficient models like Codex or GPT 3.5 back at the time. And then using these proprietary models, we would generate a rational or a chain of thought and then use that to train smaller models. And this has proven very effective to induce the ability to reason step by step into smaller models. Next, I'd like to talk about quality enhancement. So in this scheme, it's very similar to response generation, but the difference is that this time we also take the instruction and response, and then instead of using the same instruction, we prompt the model, teacher model, to generate the new instruction and a response. But the instruction would be something that's considered better than the original instruction, and the response would be a corresponding response for the better instruction. So different paper use different notations of what better could mean in this case. So for example, in this paper called evolInstruct, they trained a model called WizardLM using their data generation pipeline. So their main motivation was that let's consider that we have an initial instruction, which is 1 + 1 = question mark. So this instruction is a bit simple and very easy. So authors here proposed that given an instruction, we can make it more complex. So we could increase the reasoning difficulty into something like, what is the value of x if x³ + 2x + 3 = 7? So you could see that the instruction became a bit more complicated, while it's kind of related in that it's a math question. Or you could add more constraints, like how to prove 1 + 1 = 2 in the Goldbach conjecture. They also proposed this concept called in-breadth evolving, which is making an instruction into a different instruction to increase diversity as well. So using this pipeline recursively, they resulted in generating a larger amount of instruction and response pairs with varying difficulty. And this has proven to be very effective in their paper. Next, I'd like to mention about this paper called Mammoth 2. This paper was very interesting to me when I first read it. So they made this observation that on the web, you have a lot of question answer pairs. So ideally, these could serve as a very useful resource for training models. But the problem is that it's very unformatted and it's very kind of like the response isn't that kind or very detailed. So on the left top figure, you can see a raw document example. So the authors proposed to extract the question and the answer from this unformatted document, and then prompt the model again to make the question more complicated or have a more detailed response. So you could see in this example, they used the same question. And then if you look at the answer, it became much more detailed compared to the original response that was from the internet. So these were examples of how different papers managed to generate or refine existing data sets to obtain even better synthetic data sets. I'd like to point out that we start from this, looking into this assumption from prior works. It's that a lot of the papers kind of assume that if you use the best available language model as a teacher model, which means the model that you'll use to generate data or refine data, you're going to result in yielding higher quality data. So we want to find out if this is really true. So more formally speaking, we are very interested in whether does the ability to solve a problem well necessarily relate to the ability to generate high quality data. So this also matters a lot because companies are starting to promote to use their latest model for synthetic data generation. So for example, from NVIDIA, there was a model proposed called Nemotron for 340B. And if you look at their blog post, the title was Leverage the Latest Open Models for Synthetic Data Generation. So a lot of companies are also caring about this. So on the research question side, we're interested in this question that I mentioned, which is the data generation capability of a language model correlated to its problem-solving capability? On a practical side, I think there might be a lot of implications if you have a better understanding of this issue. So for example, people could be interested in, for example, when a new LM is released, should we use it as a teacher model or just use the original model? And also, price-wise, GPT-4o is 70 times more expensive compared to GPT-4o. So it's also very unclear whether generating 10K instances with GPT-4 is better or 170K instances with GPT-4o mini would be better. And lastly, as I mentioned, there were a lot of papers that proposed different data generation pipelines or augmentation strategies. And people could be curious of which strategy would best fit their purpose. And it was very hard to compare across different models or different pipeline strategies because, as you could see on the figure on the left, different people use different teacher models and different data generation pipelines. So it's very hard to compare across settings or across models. So in our work, we propose a new benchmark called AgoraBench that encompasses all these settings and all these different models. So although it's costly to do this, if we could have a good understanding of like how different models perform within the same data generation pipeline, it's much convenient to compare a performance across models and then have a better understanding to address these kind of questions that I mentioned. So here's a rough plot of how we conducted our experiments. So let's say we want to compare the data generation performance between model A and B. So we would use the same fixed data generation process, to obtain data A and B. And then using the same fixed training process, we would train the same model on either data A or B. And then lastly, we would use a fixed set of benchmarks to measure the performance of these trained models, and then conclude that if a student model trained on a data generated by a teacher model improves even more, that model has better data generation capabilities than the other model. So it's kind of like an extrinsic way to measure data generation performance. So we come up with this metric called performance gap recovery. It looks kind of complicated at first glance, but it's really kind of intuitive if you think about it. So in our paper, we used Llama 3.1 8B base model as the student model. And then we used the Llama 3.1 8B instruct model, which was trained by Meta with, I think, 10 million instances gathered by human experts as a reference model. So it would mean that since we're generating a small amounts of data in our experiments, we kind of assume that it's kind of hard to beat the model very carefully trained by Meta, but instead we could use it as anchor to compare performance. So what does this mean? Let's say on a particular benchmark, Llama 3.1 8B model, the base model, acquired a performance of 19.84. And then we generated a data with a teacher model T and trained the student model. And when we measure performance, let's say we acquired 28.08. In this case, the amount of improvement acquired to the base model is 55.56% because the Llama 3.1 8B instruct model would acquire 34.60. So we use this relative improvement ratio as our metric to see how much the data was useful to when like a student model was trained on it. Here are the different settings we employed. So as I mentioned before, we used 3 different data augmentation methods. And then we observed across 3 domains: math, code, and instruction following respectively. And for each of these domains, we employed 2 benchmarks: GSM-8K Math, MBPP Human Eval, and Alpaca Eval 2.0 and Arena Hard to measure the performance. So I could go into the results now. Here are the main results. We evaluated 6 different models as teacher models: GPT-4o, GPT-4o Mini, Cloud 3.5 Sonnet, and the 3 variants of Llama with varying sizes. You could see that there's a lot of numbers. I'd like to break down these into main points. So at first, you could see that overall, GPT-4 is a very performant data generator because it outperforms a lot of the different models across different categories. On the other hand, Cloud 3.5 Sonnet, you could see is particularly effective for quality enhancement and the code domain. So I think that this is really interesting because a lot of people kind of agree that Cloud is a good model for a code assistant when you want to revise your code. And it seems like based on its superior problem-solving capabilities, in this case, it kind of like connected to the ability to generate new code problems as well. And interestingly, one might assume that a larger model, for example, Llama 3.1 405B instruct, might always be a better data generator than its smaller counterpart. For example, Llama 3.1 8B instruct. But it seems like based on our experiments, this isn't always true. Like, for example, in instance generation scenario where the model has to generate new instruction response pairs, it was twice as worse than the 8B variant. This means that oftentimes a smaller model can outperform a larger model when prompted as a data generator. here's another table that might help you understand better what's going on. And here we also report the API costs to use these models. And usually when people investigate money to acquire high quality data, it might be very intuitive to assume that if you use a more expensive model, you could potentially get even higher quality data. But it seems like that wasn't true in our case. So you could see that, as I mentioned, the larger variants of llama models have worse data generation capabilities, even though they have higher problem-solving capability scores, and even though they're more expensive. And here's another plot where on the y-axis, we measured the PGR metric, the data generation capability scores. And on the x-axis, we have problem-solving capabilities, which is the average performance of the teacher model when it solves these different benchmarks. And there doesn't seem to be a very strong linear correlation in this case. So you could see that the R-squared value is very low, and although the p-value is very small, it doesn't like mean much because like there's no linear correlation in this case. So we can conclude that a better problem solver is not always a better data generator. We further did some ablation experiments here, where for each domain, using some of the models, we generated up to even more data, up to like 50K. And surprisingly, in this case, the trends kind of varied across models. So you could see on the left side, for example, code, if you generate 50K instances with the Llama 3.1 AP model, you could outperform GPT-4o as well if it only generates 10K data. On the middle and right, you could also see that if you generate more instances with GPT-4o Mini, you could acquire even better performance than generating a small amount of data with GPT-4. But this necessarily isn't always the case as well. So we concluded that sometimes generating more data with weaker LLMs could be more effective than generating less data with stronger LLMs. So looking into these results, we saw that if we couldn't determine that a model would be an effective data generator just because it's more performant or just because it's more expensive, what kind of factors does it really matter? So we have this viewpoint that we should look into the data and identify the properties to predict how much the student model would improve. So we employed these different intrinsic measurements to predict how much the student model would improve. And for example, we used the response perplexity, which means how surprising the synthetic data is to the student model. Then we also used instruction difficulty measured by LLMS judges. We also measured response quality, instruction diversity, and response diversity. So we used these 5 different intrinsic measurements and then tried to see if we could explain or predict the PGR metric or the student model's improvement. So here's the first result. We found that if we use these intrinsic measurements, we could explain the variance of the student model's improvement. So what does this mean? We conducted a PCA, a principal component analysis, using these different intrinsic measurements, and surprisingly found that these top 5 PC components sum up to about 90% of the variance of the PGR metric. And this is very optimistic because it means that there are underlying low dimension components that could be used to like explain how the PGR metric is going. And on the right side, you could see that sometimes these PC components are very interpretable. So the most important PC factor here was instruction and response diversity, and the teacher model's problem-solving capability, along as the instruction difficulty. So this is kind of contrary to the belief that response quality is the only thing that matters when you come up with new synthetic data. The second PC component you could see also correlates strongly to instruction difficulty and a lot to response quality as well. So this kind of gives you a glance of what might be important when generating new synthetic data or filtering synthetic data to train your student model. And furthermore, we used these top 5 PC components and again did a linear regression like we did in front and found out that we could result in a much better predictive model. So in this case, when we use the top 5 principal components, we get a R-squared value of 0.325, and the p-value is also statistically significant. I think this implies a lot, and then there could be a lot of exciting new future work regarding this direction. Currently, it seems like all these different intrinsic measurements matter. And the R-squared value itself is kind of optimistic, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we could predict how much the student model would improve perfectly. So this is kind of an open research question. So I'd like to conclude by talking about some takeaways from today's talk. First, with a fixed data generation pipeline, training procedure, and benchmarks, we could quantify the data generation capability of an LM using an extrinsic measurement approach, measuring how much the student model actually improves on different benchmarks. And second of all, we found that a stronger or more expensive LM is not always a better data generator. Third, we found that generating more data with a weaker model could sometimes be more effective than generating less amounts of data with a stronger model. And lastly, we could explain the variance and partially predict the student model's improvement and looking into the generated data using intrinsic measurements. So that's all I prepared for today, and I'd be happy to take questions.